Going on. All right. So, England at the dawn of the 18th century, the late Stuarts, we had the Restoration, we went through the Glorious Revolution with the possibility that England would have Catholic kings and the people, the government basically saying we don't want that. We talked about whether it's really a revolution or more like a kind of something going on among the elite, because there's a lot of debate about how much that glorious revolution was really glorious. Uh, we teach it in history that everybody got what they wanted, but in the 18th century, we can see that the poor people suffer really badly. I'd like perhaps to look forward a little bit into the 18th century. That's something else we might find interesting. But let's just take a look at the position now as the Stuart period starts to come to an end. So let's take a look at England and her relationship with the local countries around. Wales was the first part of Britain to come under English control. I put from the time of Henry VIII, but even before that, even before Henry VIII, Wales was effectively under English control. And so much so that people often did, when they said England, it was kind of a tarimai. It means Wales as well. Okay, so there's, if you go to Wales today, you can see, well, there is a Welsh identity, there's a Welsh language. Wales is different from England, but it's been politically connected with England for so long that it's, I think there are some Welsh people that would like to be independent, but it's a fairly small minority. It's not a popular feeling. Like in Scotland when they had a referendum, okay, quite a lot of people wanted to be independent from England. When Ireland already, nearly 100 years ago, had the chance to become independent, most of Ireland became independent. But Wales is kind of closer. It's been with England the longest. It's had the longest relationship. That was already, at the beginning of our period, that was already there. But yes, and of course we said the Tudors were a Welsh family. And the Stuart monarchs helped to bring Scotland and England together. There wasn't a formal bringing together. They weren't formally united until the early 18th century, 1707, but the two countries were effectively together because they had the same king. Okay? They had their own parliament. The Scottish parliament was separate from the English parliament, and as we saw, there were times when England and Scotland were kind of fighting with each other about religion and so on. But basically, the two countries had had a very close relationship during the Stuart period. And then, after 1707, that's when, if I was teaching this period, I would stop talking about England, and I'd be talking about Britain, or I'd be talking about the United Kingdom. Because the three countries are now together from 1707 onwards. So from the beginning of the 18th century, the three countries are together, and then Ireland, 100 years later, will also become part of this United Kingdom. Okay, not until 1801. And it was always, Ireland was always the poor cousin, the most mistreated area of the British Isles. It didn't have a very positive relationship. If you think of, Middle Ages in Scotland, life was pretty tough for people. And then after Scotland joined together with England, Scotland in the 18th century is kind of Orgong Jidai. It's connected with England. It has the same access to wealth, more or less. I mean, some people would say that Scotland was still a bit poorer, but the Industrial Revolution came. Many of those technological developments came from Scotland. Okay? And Scotland contributed to the Industrial Revolution. Scotland was very much part of the development of the United Kingdom. But Ireland, no. Ireland was left outside all of that. And particularly, if the Irish people are going to think back, they will think to that man that we talked about, that Oliver Cromwell. They would especially hate him, okay, because he was especially strict in Ireland. And the policy, do you remember that I said, how does London control If you look at one of my famous maps, London's down here and Ireland is over here. How does London control Ireland? Well, they had the idea of let's send people, Protestant people, mostly from Scotland, into Ireland. Okay? And they did not, of course, go into the middle of Ireland, which would be risky. You know, just a few Scottish people going into the middle of Ireland and saying, well, Oliver Cromwell says I'm the boss here. They say, sure, you're the boss, come here. They would kill them, basically. So what happened was they all kind of kept together in a group up here in the north. And, or most of them kept together in a group there in the north. In fact, they became the majority. There were more Protestants than Catholics, which is why today this area is still part of Britain. Okay? They didn't want to become independent. It was Catholic Ireland that wanted to separate off, but this part, which was mainly Protestant, wanted to stay together in the United Kingdom. So the history of that goes back a long way. The history goes back to the Chusejdai, the Middle Ages. It goes back to Queen Elizabeth, but it especially goes back to Oliver Cromwell, who promoted this policy of encouraging Protestant people from Scotland to move into Ireland and giving them special privileges and control. So James himself, the king who was pushed out, firstly he went to France, then he went to Ireland, and he tried to get support from Catholics, mostly, to get his power back, to get his position back. And a war was fought in Ireland. So William was trying to protect his position through a war in Ireland against the Jacobites. Remember the Jacobites, the supporters of James. Okay? And by the end of this war, which is called the Williamite War, the Jacobite movement was defeated completely. They lost. But it's not just that. The general feeling that was going against Catholics was now very, very strong, and the status of the Catholic people in Ireland was now very low. Basically, all over Ireland, there were Protestants, especially in the north here. But all over Ireland, there were Protestants. And those Protestants were the ones who were given the rights, the power, and the country is dominated by Protestants for 200 years after this. Okay? And it's pretty shocking what the English did here to the Catholic population. As I say, there's this policy of encouraging British Protestants to settle in Ireland, and especially in the north of Ireland, many of them were Scottish. And the Catholics in Ireland were more and more under the control of the Protestant settlers. It's particularly ironic, this situation in Northern Ireland, because of course they are Celtic, they are both Celtic people, but they are divided by, historically by religion and today by politics. So, these are the kinds of things. From 1607, Catholics were not allowed to hold public office. They were not allowed to serve in the army, and they were obliged to go to the Church of England church services. They had to go to the Eikokokyokai church. For a while, until 1652, they were allowed to be members of the House of Commons, but even that was prohibited in 1652. So through the 17th century, our century, we're seeing Ireland's position, the Catholics in Ireland, their position is getting worse and worse. And then there is this war against the Jacobites, this Williamite war. Now, at the time of the Restoration, things got a little bit easier for Catholics in Ireland, but then this Williamite war made a strong backlash. Even stricter laws were made, so that the 18th century became a real hell for the Irish people. Okay, they may not marry Protestants. They're not allowed to have a horse. They can't teach and run a school. They can't own guns. They can't vote. They can't buy land. They can't convert to Catholicism. They can't inherit Protestant land. They can't practice law. They're not allowed to go abroad to be educated. They have to stay in Ireland under very, very strict control. So, yeah, please ask a question if you know. Okay, so these are some of the kind of laws that were made against the Irish by the English at this time. Notice that Ireland at this time would be technically a Shokuminshi, a colony of England, or of Britain. It's not part of the United Kingdom. They don't have equality. I think you could say that the British Empire, the first colony of the British Empire is Ireland. And it's probably also Ichigan Gyakutai Sarita colony. It's the colony that was treated worst of all the colonies. So these are some of the problems that are going on. It's a very poor country. And so these people are living in poverty, and with all these restrictions, they can't get themselves a decent education, however much they might try. It's difficult enough just getting food to eat. They're not allowed to own their own property. They have to rent their property from Protestant landlords. This kind of thing. And this was called the Protestant Ascendancy, the period from 1691 to 1801. So that period is beginning at the end of the Stuart dynasty, the end of the Stuart period. And then, of course, we often hear about, the slavery from Africa, the slave trade, the triangular trade, the slave triangle from Africa. It's perhaps not quite so famous, but it's still true that tens or maybe even hundreds of thousands of Irish people were also shipped off. It's not clear, it's still debated whether they were actually slaves or whether they were indentured labourers. The difference is only fairly small. The basic fact is that they were very poor, they didn't have much choice, they didn't have any rights. So they may not have been, some historians will say they were slaves, and some historians will say, no, they were indentured labourers. But there's not much, in reality, there's not much difference. And then, even after Ireland did join with the United Kingdom in 1801, there's still discrimination against the Catholic Irish. Now, last week, if you remember, I talked about the British Commonwealth, because I was saying, there's the English, was it last week or 2 weeks ago? Anyway, I was talking about the English Commonwealth and the British Commonwealth. Two different things. Oliver Cromwell's period was called the English Commonwealth. Okay, or the Commonwealth of England, or it had slightly different names, England and Scotland, but it was basically a word used to express Oliver Cromwell's rule. And I said, Konganshinai Kudasai, don't get confused with the British Commonwealth. Okay? The British Commonwealth is now called the Commonwealth of Nations, and it's an organization of about 53 countries that were, before, were part of the British Empire. And I'm mentioning it here because there are only one or two countries from that Shokuminshi Jidai that are not part of the British Commonwealth, that don't want to keep some kind of relationship with Britain today. One of those countries is Ireland. Okay, Minami Ireland, Southern Ireland, Dokoritsu ni natta toki, when it became independent, it fairly quickly left the British Commonwealth, and today it remains outside the Commonwealth of Nations, although it still has a very close relationship. A lot of Irish people go to work in England or Scotland. English people, Scottish people go on holiday in Ireland. Okay, but they don't want that formal relationship. Thank you, but we're independent. We had enough. And they did have a very, very bad time. So let's move on and look at England in its global context. When we started this story at the beginning of the 16th century, there was no global context for England, really. It was an isolated little country with some connections with France and Spain, and a little bit of connection with other parts of Europe, but essentially it was an isolated island of not much power just off the coast of Europe. But during this period, England was fighting several wars in Europe. There were wars between England and Holland in the 1650s and through to the 1670s. The Anglo-Dutch Wars, which basically were wars fighting for control of trade. And I think this is what needs to be understood about the whole process of colonization and the way that the British Empire developed. It was all about goods. It was all about money. Right? It wasn't about, for example, political ideology. You should think like us. It wasn't about religion. You should believe like us. It was basically about, we want your markets. We want your goods. Okay? And Europe was fighting inside itself for control of markets around the world. This is basically what's going on. At this time, in the 17th century, England is largely unsuccessful, and it's Holland that is developing control of the major trading routes. It's an accident of history, really. It was the British Empire. It could have been the Dutch Empire that was famous around the world. During the 17th century, that's what it looked like, that it was going to be the Dutch. The Spanish had started things, but they had kind of lost it. They'd lost power. And the Latin American countries had largely become independent of Spanish influence. Holland was the powerful country at this time. It was developing its trading routes, and England was kind of losing out to Holland. But then, in the early 18th century, in the first half of the 18th centuries, England was engaged in a series of wars against France. France was another empire builder. There are still parts of the world that are French-speaking because of the French Empire. Okay, parts of Africa, other parts of Asia, other places around the world that are French-speaking. I had a wonderful experience, twice actually, going to New Caledonia. It's a French colony even today. Okay? So the French were extending their power, and England was fighting against the French and other European countries as well. But basically, the main reason for these wars, the main reason was to control the developing markets. Okay, controlling not just the colonies, but the trading routes. It's the goods that they're interested in. Can you think of some of the goods that were important at that time? Do you have any idea what goods I'm talking about? For example, if you go back to the very first lesson, I said things like, you know, did William Shakespeare drink tea? Okay, this is the sort of thing that was not available in the Chuseiji Dai. They didn't know that tea existed. Okay, once they know that tea exists, there's a market for it. Okay, and that market develops, as we saw. James II's wife introduced the custom of tea drinking, which became fashionable among the society, and so that's an example of a market. England cannot grow, Britain cannot grow tea. It doesn't have the climate for it. But there's a market in Britain and in Europe generally. There's a market for tea. Can you think of any others? Tobacco. Good. Again, it can't be grown inside Britain. Anything else? Think of the things that Chuseiji Dai people could never have these products. They didn't know about these products. Sorry? Silk. Yeah, silk. Well, actually, silk, yes, they did have to a certain extent, but what they didn't have, because there were trading routes even in the Middle Ages for silk. But so yes, up to a point. But as you know, the Silk Road was famous. Silk was an exception. It had been kind of transported because it was valuable and even small quantities. But rather than silk, no, another, well, yes, you were right about spices, but another, I mean, you are right, actually, yes, so I'll put spices up. But I'm thinking of another item for clothing. Cotton, that was the big one, right? Cotton. Okay, silk had already been available because it could, you know, even in small quantities, it would come into Europe through the Silk Road, through history. But it would only provide clothing for the very rich people because it was very expensive. Cotton was much more freely available, it's much cheaper. And once you could start importing cotton in large quantities, then that, of course, cotton is going to be especially important because it's going to be one of the big things making the Industrial Revolution. Britain gets the cotton and then makes it into clothes, then sells the clothes back to those countries because they've got the factories. Okay, so cotton was going to be very, very important in the Industrial Revolution. The cotton factories were making clothing. They imported the raw cotton and they made it into clothing. So this is going to be late 18th century. All right, but the actual Industrial Revolution. But cotton is becoming more and more the material that they use for making clothes. You see, in the Chuseiji Dai, the only material that they had at home really was wool. Okay, there were lots of sheep. It was a sheep farming country. England was full of sheep. And wool, you know, you had to wear wool next to your skin. Okay, not so comfortable. All right, so they were very happy when they found that they could use this cotton material. But there were other materials as well, spices, as you say, coffee. All right, these kinds of products were the reason that Europe was fighting these wars. And of course, there are all sorts of things like, well, in oranges. Of course, in North Africa, the south of Spain, you can have oranges, but what about bananas? Okay, all kinds of tropical fruits and products like that. Okay, was slowly coming into the market. By 1753, when these wars with France came to an end, England, or I should really be saying Britain, England, Wales, and Scotland, Britain had got the best of its European empires, and Britain now controlled an empire. So by the middle of the 18th century, we've got the British Empire. But the British Empire has its beginnings with a company set up by Queen Elizabeth in 1600. Okay, that company is the East India Company. Okay, the East India Company was very, very famous company, which I think I said was far more powerful in its day than McDonald's or Coca-Cola or any of these big, giants of the economy today. It had its own army. Okay, it would invade countries. It would kill people to get what it wanted. All right, so the East India Company was actually set up at the beginning of the 17th century by Queen Elizabeth, and by the time we get to 1753, the East India Company is huge. Possibly, we can argue it was more powerful than Britain itself, more powerful than the government, because it was just a huge economic giant that eventually the government took under its own control. So let's look back at how things have developed here. At the beginning of the Tudor period, England had control over Wales and a small part of Ireland. Okay, just that little bit. As I said, it's a pretty isolated little island up there if we look at, I've taken 1492 in the top left-hand corner there. That's the year that Columbus discovered America. Okay, going from Spain and discovering that there was a whole new world over here that they didn't know about, the Europeans didn't know about. At that time, England was a fairly unimportant little country. Okay, we can see it there. It's got control of Wales, it's got control of some little parts of Ireland. Okay, but it's basically not an important feature on the map. So, we move 150 years or so forwards, and England has gained control over effectively the whole of the British Isles. It's not politically united, but it has control. And it's also established colonies. Look at all these colonies. There were no colonies, successful ones, in the 16th century. But in the 17th century, these colonies started to develop and grow. But first they were not successful, the people died or they had to leave. But now, by the middle of the 17th century, look at what we've got. Right over there in India, okay? South America, North America, bits of Africa, all right? We've got an incredible spread of British English or British influence around the world. And as I say, it's happening with other countries. We could show a similar map at this stage for Holland. We could show a similar map for France. And Spain had its Latin American possessions, although slowly it sort of lost control of them. This is what Europe was doing. And it was doing it mostly because it wanted control of the markets. And then, over the next 100 years or so, the colonies grow and new territories are added. Now, if you look at this, it doesn't seem so different. So, nani kawaranai mitai kedo. What's a bit more area in India, for example, a little bit of a spread of possessions. But what's really changing here is infrastructure. If you were to look at these, if you were to go to any of these places in 1660, they were going to be very primitive, quite dangerous places to be. They would be open to attack from local people. The houses would be made of wood. Life would be hard. Mostly the people who went were men. There'd be very few women out in, white women out in that part of the world. By the time you get through to the middle of the 18th century, then you've got a much more developed infrastructure. You've got houses made of bricks and stones, looking rather like English villages. They're looking rather like English towns, only hundreds or thousands of miles away from England. And you've got families growing up there. You've got established colonies that are not just men going and trading for a few years and then going back home, but families that are born there and living there and growing up there. And then, of course, this is going to what am I doing? Oh, sorry, I'm going backwards and forwards here. Let's move on. Okay, so we're showing you between that century that things have not changed very much, just the infrastructure. But then by the time we get to the British Empire in its height in the early 19th century, look at that. Oh, sorry, the early 20th century. So through the 19th century, it just keeps on growing. All right. I know this is not the Tudor and Stuart period, but this began during our period. And it's important to see how it continued. Half of the world seems to belong to Britain. Okay? And we still, in a map like this, cannot show the true importance of the British Empire, because even though there's so many areas marked in red, there are many, many more areas that we cannot really see on this map. If you look here, you can see these little red dots here, but there are little red dots all sort of scattered across the oceans. And this is how the British Empire developed. Any of these little islands, British ships can go and they can get fresh supplies. Okay? Here's a safe port for us. All right? We can refresh ourselves, we can rest, we can get more food, we can get anything we need. So the rule Britannia rule the waves. One of the famous songs of the British Empire. It rules the sea. It could be, by controlling the routes across the water, it controlled the planet. Because that's how people moved. There were no aeroplanes. All right? Traveling across land was difficult and dangerous. It was the sea voyages. And we can see things like the canal here, the Suez Canal. Later on, we'll see there's the Panama Canal. These canals making it so that instead of having to go all the way around Africa to get up to India, they could just go straight through here. All right? They developed canals and things so that their ships could get through easily. And this is the kind of thing. So it's a huge and powerful empire at the beginning of the 20th century. Here we are at the beginning of the 21st century, and it's more or less gone back to the beginning. Okay? Things have gone back more or less to where they were at the beginning. And it could have been worse. It could be worse. I mean, as you can see, most of Ireland is independent. There was a referendum about Scotland, and a lot of Scottish people wanted to be independent, but the vote was to stay for now inside the United Kingdom. But with Brexit, it's possible that Scotland will say, well, we don't, we also want to become independent from you, because it was England, mostly England and Wales, were voting for independence from Europe, voting for Brexit. Scotland wanted to stay. But what you can see is these little islands, some of them are still there. But you can see a little area in the south of Spain, Gibraltar. You can see one or two islands still around there that Britain still keeps control of even today. Okay? So it hasn't quite lost everything. But as I say, it retains this relationship with many of those countries through the British Empire. So the wheel's gone almost full circle. Most of Ireland's independent. Scotland narrowly lost a referendum. And there are just a few remote islands and overseas territories that the British keep control of. If you're probably too young to remember, but Margaret Thatcher fought a war over the largest of these, the Falkland Islands, against Argentina, that wanted to take control of those islands. The British Prime Minister went to war to keep those islands. I don't know why they're so important, but she was ready to have a war to keep them. She had a war. And Gibraltar in the south of Spain, most Spanish people are not very happy that part of Spain belongs to England, belongs to Britain, but that's the position. So yes, these are the little island possessions that remain. Okay. Well, Gibraltar is not an island, but basically those are the remaining little bits of the British Empire. That's what's left. And this Commonwealth of Nations is the countries that you can see here in blue. And as you can see, many of them, they overlap. Ooh, what's that? They overlap with the countries that were part of the empire. Okay, so this Commonwealth of Nations today, it is a kind of trading relationship. It's a cultural relationship. There's things like the Commonwealth Games, which are like a kind of Olympics just for those countries, those 50 countries. If you're not from a country that was, a shokuminchi, maybe you've never heard of the British Commonwealth or the Commonwealth of Nations, but it continues to be active in the world. It makes policies, even political pressure. If one of these countries is behaving badly, the other countries unite and say stop, or we'll kick you out. Okay, and one or two countries have been told you can't stay in the Commonwealth unless you change your political ideas. Like the dictator, for example, who's killing his own people or something like that. So yeah, these countries continue to have some kind of relationship today. So this all has its beginning in our period, in our early modern period. Okay. They won't all stand still. Well, okay, we've got the Fundamental Laws of England, which is another law that was passed later on. We've got, sorry, I think they're going to come up one by one. Yeah, okay, that one. Then we've got the American Declaration of Independence, which has some of the Bill of Rights kind of details inside it. We've got, what's the next one? They're jumping around there. The American Bill of Rights, which has some of the English Bill of Rights details inside it. We've got French Declaration of the Rights of Man in the French Revolution. That's got some aspects of the Bill of Rights. We've got United Nations, Kokureng, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Okay, all of these documents, important documents about human rights that are still influencing the world today, they all go back, not completely, but they all draw parts of their content from the English Bill of Rights of 1689. This was the first of those important pieces of legislation for human rights. Okay, yeah, sorry about that. The presentation's a bit weird there. And urban society that is living in cities, living in towns and cities. This is part of the move towards the Industrial Revolution, is part of the move towards the kind of world that we have today. We get the first newspaper in 1620. England was a little bit late with newspapers, as I said at the beginning of the course. The laws were quite strict. So the first newspapers were made in Holland and brought into England because the printing laws were quite strict in England at that time. But we start to have newspapers in the early 17th century. And the first newspaper was published in Amsterdam and shipped into England because of the printing laws in England at that time. Then we get coffee shops, 1650. A couple of years later in London, we get a coffee shop. And these two things often went together. Newspapers were read in coffee shops. And of course, people would talk about the contents. So you're beginning to get the media and people getting together and talking about the news that's in the media. This is a kind of process that didn't exist before. All right? There would only be kind of uwasa about what was going on in the world. Nobody would really know anything. Then you start to get large numbers of newspapers appearing in the 1640s with lots of different political points of view. So some newspapers are telling you one thing, it's a bit like today, fake news. Okay? People trying to work out, well, what's true? This newspaper says one thing, this newspaper says something. What's the truth here? Okay, so a lot of debate about trying to figure out what was right and what was going on. People were thinking deeply about these things. And this is, of course, the time of the Civil War. The print media had a huge influence here. This is the first time, really, that the print media is really influencing politics, influencing the shape of the Civil War, influencing people's thinking during this period. And they're getting together in coffee shops where they can talk about what's being printed. And this whole way of expressing information. You remember what I said about how they communicated information in the Tudor period. A man would stand up in the middle of the square and tell everybody what he thought, or what his version of the truth, and then all of those people would go and tell their friends and their family, and that's how news would spread in the Tudor period. In this period, it's happening through print. You're getting newspapers, and you're getting people sitting around in coffee shops and talking about it. You've got the official newspaper of the government or the king, the London Gazette, and you're getting, so people can say, I want to listen to the news I want to read the news as expressed by the official kind of government or the king. Other people would say, no, I want to listen to I want this minority view. People were able to choose their politics and their information. Again, very much like today where you can switch channels. Some people want to watch, one kind of news input and that sees the news in one way, other people another. And by the end of the 17th century, you've got about 3,000 coffee shops in London alone. Dozens and dozens of newspapers or pamphlets that are carrying news, broadsheets and things, typically published 2 or 3 times a week. So people would go into the coffee shop, they would read these things, and we're talking about thousands of coffee shops just inside London. And then other big cities would have many coffee shops as well. So this is changing the face of life, changing the way that people are experiencing their life. Before this, the church was the only place where people were meeting up, really. And in the pubs, people would meet to drink, but they didn't want to talk about politics in the pub. It was usually kinship. Talk about politics and people will start fighting. So please don't talk about politics or religion in the pub. Nomiai tatoki, when they went for a drink, politics and religion were usually non-topics. But in the coffee shops, that would be the central topic. And you start to get a proper daily newspaper in the early 18th century that looks very much like newspapers that we have today. So sitting in a coffee shop, reading your newspaper, that's something that you can do today. And you could do it in the early 18th century. But you couldn't do it in Queen Elizabeth's time. Okay? It's one of the things that's changing. It's changing the face of society. Some of the famous coffee houses. Lloyd's. Now, it starts off as a coffee house, but as people start talking, they start realizing, oh, you're interested in, economics. You're interested in, things like insurance of housing, insurance, health insurance. You're interested in that kind of, let's make our own company. So the coffee shop actually becomes the start of a huge banking operation, which still exists today. So when we think of Lloyd's, today people will think of banking, insurance, economy. It started as a coffee shop, okay? The people who went to that coffee shop were focused on economics, and they developed this company from that. Jonathan's. From the coffee shop, I know you have a Jonathan's here in Japan. This is a little bit different. I'm not sure about the origins of the Japanese Jonathan's, but the coffee house Jonathan's is where the kabu started, the whole idea of stock exchange. There was no such idea in Queen Elizabeth's time. Okay? It's through meeting together with other people and talking. People said, here's an idea. Okay, we can make a company and then we can invite people to have an interest in the company and they pay money into the company. If the company does well, all these people get money back. And we can get their money, but they can get something back. So, well, shall we try it? Okay, so this is where that kind of thing got started. Batson's was a coffee shop originally, but it became a doctor's surgery. All right, medical practitioners would go to Batson's, and it just started developing from being a coffee shop into being a doctor's surgery. Okay. The Grecian coffee shop was where the scientists would go. And they'd start, talking about new discoveries and new inventions, and it was a place to get together and talk about these things. It would attract people who were interested in those things. Will's was a focal point for writers. So these coffee shops started to create the bodies, the economic and social, the doctors' surgeries, all of these kinds of things, the stock exchange that we have today, many of them were born in the coffee shop. There's the coffee shop, okay? But it's not just a place for drinking coffee. These people are getting together to make policy, all right? One thing is that coffee is quite expensive, so poor people aren't going to be in there. Another thing is that it's not alcohol, so they're not going to get angry and they're not going to start wanting to sing and dance, or it's a different atmosphere. This is a serious place where they can sit and they drink coffee and they talk policy. They start planning, okay? All kinds of institutions and organizations. And then we get lots of the big companies that we still have today, Christie's, Sotheby's, Twinings, Fortnum and Mason. You probably know a lot of these big elite department stores if you've been to London or anything like that, or even here in Japan, some of these are famous. The auction house, Sotheby's, is famous around the world. These kinds of institutions also start to develop, very often taking their starting point as being people talking together in the coffee shops. Now, you may think, oh, you know, Twinings, 18th century. It's not so old. Japan has businesses that are over 1,000 years old. Japan has the world's oldest businesses, the world's oldest companies, but they're usually very small. They're family companies that continue through the generations, and they're very small things. Okay, they work in a very small, specialized area. Okay, these are big international companies. That's the difference here. This is when this idea of a big international company gets started. So it may not seem so old compared with the oldest of the Japanese companies, but it's the size of these companies that makes the difference. In science and technology, of course, the world is moving ahead very quickly. In the Elizabethan period, Juroku Seiki, we have Francis Bacon, the father of modern science, and he's developing the modern scientific method, the way of testing things. Let's make sure if it's true. Okay? Here's a process for checking the truth of our ideas, our theories. So Francis Bacon starting the process back in the 16th century. Then you've got doctors, physicians, developing our understanding of the human body, Gilbert, Harvey, showing how blood moves around the body, showing what the different organs, what they actually do, this kind of thing. That sort of understanding was not developed in the Middle Ages, and they didn't have a realistic sense of medicine in the way that we have today. And this is starting in the 17th century. Chemistry. Robert Boyle would be the most famous of the English early chemists. We've got the Royal Society for Improving Natural Knowledge, founded in 1660, and this is, again, it's a place where people can come together to discuss scientific advances and scientific development, to compare their theories, to publish their ideas. Things are starting to take off scientifically. The Royal Observatory. Britain was in the lead in those days in exploring the skies, the stars, the positions of the stars, which stars have planets going around them, this kind of thing. So Britain's, even today, has quite an important part to play in astronomy. And it had a head start right back in the 17th century. And of course, the laws of motion, Iryoku, the law of gravity, came from Isaac Newton. And the laws of motion, why do things move? How do they move? What makes things move? If you drop an apple and an apple tree from the top of a tall building, which one hits the ground first? It's the same. They fall at the same speed. Why? Why doesn't the bigger one fall faster? Why does a feather fall slowly? A feather wouldn't be the same. So, he works these kinds of things out. And it's the first time that anybody's really thought about these kinds of questions. So, these all lead the way of thinking towards the Enlightenment, which is also called the Age of Reason. And this in turn leads to practical developments, practical applications which make the Industrial Revolution possible. So the scientific thinking that starts to take off in the 17th century is leading to the Industrial Revolution later on in the 18th century.